Trim complete. Processed 49. Quarantined 2. Renaming complete. 52 files renamed. Album art complete. Found 0 local artworks. New files sorted. 52 placed in worded folders. Quarantined 4 empty music folders. LVC JSON generation complete with multi-word groups. Linux voice control restarted.
This is a fight for freedom. It's for NATO.
New slate of tariffs.
The national emergency is avoiding a national emergency.
Today, President Trump showing no signs of backing down. In an exclusive phone interview with NBC News, when asked if he will follow through on those tariffs, absent a deal on Greenland, President Trump saying, quote, "I will, 100%. And when asked if he would use force to seize Greenland and Europe has been intense. On Saturday, at least 1,000 Greenlanders marching in opposition to a U.S. takeover, waving their national flags and reiterating the territory is not for sale. Some demonstrators wearing their own version of a MAGA hat. Make America go away. This was their message to the U.S. president.
This is a fight for freedom, it's for NATO, it's for everything the Western Hemisphere has been fighting for since World War II.
And I hope that this focus of taking control of Greenland, total control of Greenland, will no longer, that will disappear again. We just want to live in quiet and peace and with each other in this great country.
It's surreal and it's unreal to be part of that circus he's doing right now.
Meanwhile, European leaders are weighing their response. Germany and France equating the latest tariff threats to blackmail. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer also condemning the escalation.
But we must stand up for our values. We must be clear about the principles that we are applying, and we'll continue to do so. Threatening tariffs on allies is the wrong thing to do completely. And a trade war is not in our interest.
All of this comes as Norway's Prime Minister went public with a recent message he received from President Trump, where Trump blamed Norway for not giving him the Nobel Peace Prize, saying, quote, "No one would feel an obligation to purely of peace." President Trump went on to repeat his claim that Denmark cannot protect Greenland from Russia and China. We should note, Norway's government does not play a role in awarding the Nobel Peace Prize. Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Hake, NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent and chief Washington correspondent Andrew Mitchell, and NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Sean. Thank you all so much for joining me. Garrett, I want to start with you at the White House. What should we make of this recent escalation between President Trump and European allies? Is there any off-ramp the president would accept, or is it all for nothing?
Yeah, I mean, Gabe, the irony of all this is there are plenty of off-ramps available to the president here that would accomplish his stated goals of trying to improve U.S. security in the Arctic. The Danes and the Greenlandic people have all said they would welcome more U.S. involvement. We have some bases there already. There's the option to open more. Everything the president says he wants is on the table. When I'm confused in a situation like this, I try to think through the kind of art of the deal framework here. And to me, that suggests that what we may be seeing from the president here is to try to kind of create this maximalist position and get a better bargain if there ultimately is an opportunity to buy Greenland. Our own reporting at NBC News has been that the price tag could be as high as $700 billion. That's money we don't have. Perhaps the president sees this pressure campaign and the ambiguity around military force as a way to make Greenland ultimately cheaper, but it does seem to be very much having the opposite effect in democratic nations whose people are now hardening their opposition to U.S. involvement there at all.
Yeah, you know, Garrett and our colleague Kristen Walker asked the Treasury Secretary whether this may be part of some negotiation. He kind of dodged that question. But Garrett, I want to ask you about, does the president have the political capital to prolong this fight over Greenland? We've been looking at that poll, right, that says that a vast majority of Americans would be opposed to any military takeover of Greenland. Does he really want to burn political capital on this?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are bad for the president in public opinion surveys. Deeply underwater, disapproval ratings in the 70, high 80%, depending on the options that are put before the American people. If the president wants to press this issue, he's going to have to sell it a lot more, Gabe. I mean, I covered the entirety of his presidential campaign. This was not a stump speech issue. This was not something like the deportation campaigns, for example, that the president broadly previewed for the American people. This is something that he talked about a little bit in the first term. He's become very focused on it in the second term. He's faced significant but not overwhelming pushback from elected Republicans. I think to really shut this down, you would need to see more outspokenness from elected Republicans and perhaps a stronger market reaction. The markets have been notably cool on all of this so far.
You know, Garrett, you mentioned the slight pushback from some elected Republicans. During the president's first term, we often talked about the adults in the room, right? So is there anyone within the president's inner circle right now who is urging restraint?
Doesn't appear to be so, Gabe, and I think it's important that people remember this is a very different team with a very different way of thinking about how they serve President Trump. In the first term, there were so many hands around him who felt like it was their job to try to channel him in some way or prevent his worst instincts or instincts they disagreed with from becoming policy. That's not the case here. From Susie Wiles to Stephen Miller to the Vice President, this is a team around President Trump who believes it is their job to take his ideas and put them into practice to the best ability that they can. And so the idea that he'll be talked out of this by someone who works in the building behind me, I think is extraordinarily unlikely.
Thank you. I want to turn now to Andrew Mitchell.
The next voice control stopped.
How significant a rift is President Trump causing with Europe right now? How is Europe looking to potentially respond? There's talk of the so-called trade bazooka. Fill us in.
It is extraordinarily to our NATO allies. It could, as the Danish Prime Minister said, it could absolutely destroy NATO, because this is the first time in history, and we're talking about 76 years of post-war NATO history, which has succeeded to get France and Germany to stop fighting with each other, to keep peace in Europe until, of course, the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. And this would be the first time that NATO would be challenged from inside, from a NATO member, and the most important member, the United States, of course. So the president's been so successful in getting NATO to do what it needed to do, which is to come up to a 5% goal of spending.
21, quarantine 0.
He's repeated that very often. He's been successful in that.
Article 1 for him, and he actually should
renaming complete.
Praising
21
NATO
files
for
renamed.
Exceeding to him. He's dominating NATO and Europe.
Album art
and
complete.
Instead, he's challenging them in a way that is so profound and is so angering. You've seen a couple of, the Germans sent 2 days of reconnaissance mission, 13 people in that mission, but there was a symbolic reconnaissance mission.
Files sorted.
They are determined
21 placed in
that
worded
they will
folders.
retaliate. They had put tariffs or territorial tariffs on hold at the end of last year, but now they're resurrecting that, and they're hoping that in Davos, where the president will be going in the next couple of days, that in Davos that there is some off-ramp. But the off-ramp is so clear. We have 1 base and 200 troops. We had 17 bases, 10,000 troops at the high point. We have a 1951 treaty with Denmark over Greenland.
And Denmark said we could have more. We could have more troops there.
We could have more troops that we could build up again. NATO is willing to spend this money. So it is a crisis.
LVC JSON generation complete with multi-word groups.
And they say they haven't seen a Chinese warship in 10 years. Certainly the Russians are there. The Arctic is important. And now he's talking about Canada again. Just as Mark Carney, the leader of Canada, has gone to China to pivot away from the U.S.
So you mentioned, it is a concern, at least, potentially with Russia and China. But we heard Secretary Bessent tell Kristen Welker a little earlier in the program that the national emergency is to avoid a national emergency.
That is circular reasoning. Bessent is supposedly the grown-up in the room on the Jay Powell issue and other big issues.
Linux voice control restarted.
To a certain extent. Bessent here is just saluting.
Well, you mentioned Davos. I'm curious, you've covered this for a very long time. How awkward do you think some of these conversations will be there? How do you think that all of this will overshadow whatever message the president was hoping to send at Davos?
Well, it certainly will overshadow the message, but also people don't understand. People who dealt with diplomacy, with treaties, and he's got opposition in the Senate to this. And it would be $700 to $800 billion, according to the best estimates that NBC had published, to even buy it. But he told the New York Times when they said, you can have it without buying it, he said, I don't like to rent or I like to buy. I like to own things, is basically the paraphrase. So nobody really understands the mentality. To him, it's the biggest estate deal, it's his legacy. He sees it as Jeffersonian. Jefferson got the Louisiana Purchase, Sewell got the Arctic, but it's the biggest possible land deal, but it is so antithetical to American interests.
Starting Jason security scan.
Thank you so much for being here. And I want to turn now to Brian Chung. Brian, what would these 10% tariffs mean for consumers here in the U.S.? What kind of goods likely would be impacted?
Well, Gabe, as we've been covering throughout all of these tariffs, it would impact any imports coming into this country because, as we know, is the way that these tariffs have operated so far, it is the American companies that are importing them that are paying most of those costs. In fact, there was a recent report just in the last few days that suggested almost 100%, well over 90% of those tariffs are borne by American companies that are importing those goods, not the exporting country like the European Union in the case of the tariffs that we're talking about here. But there are a lot of practical questions over exactly what the president plans on doing here. Yes, there was that pretty detailed Truth Social post where just on the graphic we showed you, there are 8 countries that would be targeted under these tariffs. It would be 10% beginning on February 1st. That would ratchet up to 25% once we get to June. Well, yes, indeed, even though it's only 8 countries that are being targeted, there is a question over whether or not it is de facto an entire tariff on the European Union because of the fact that European goods, when they come to this country, are not designated as a country of origin for, let's say, France or Finland. It's just bucketed as the European Union. So it's actually unclear if the president will be able to tariff just individually those 8 countries. Some in the European Union are treating this as an entire tariff on the whole block. And you would imagine that would raise prices pretty substantially for the many European goods that we import here in the United States.
And Brian, we were talking about this a little bit with Andrew, but the European Union is threatening to retaliate with its own tariffs. What could that look like?
Yeah, well, these are countermeasures that were actually floated by the European Union, as Andrew was saying, at the end of last year. They were put on ice as part of the cooling of negotiations between the United States and the European Union. But it'd be about $110 billion US dollars on goods like, for example, agricultural products, industrial goods, Boeing airplanes. That's a big deal because of the rivalry between Boeing and the French Airbus company. But these are tariffs that would be effectively put back into place if it is indeed the case that the European Union feels the need to escalate it to that point. This is the card that they are leaning on in response to these Greenland threats. But again, whether or not they actually get there, they did not ultimately implement them last year. We'll see if this is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back and forcing them to do so.
And Brian, as if we didn't have enough news to follow already in 2026, we're also waiting for the Supreme Court's ruling on some of the president's tariffs. Would that ruling, how would these latest tariff threats, what would happen if the Supreme Court struck down these tariffs?
Well, there is a bit of uncertainty around that because we don't know what legal authority the president is trying to lean on to implement this new round of tariffs on those 8 countries that he described. Presumably, it would be under the same statute that he was trying to implement those Rose Garden tariffs, as you recall, which were shown on that flashy poster board in the Rose Garden in April of last year. In this case, he would be using it essentially in a different way, saying that to the Secretary of the Treasury's words, this is an emergency situation that the United States needs Greenland to protect its own interests from any sort of potential military action from Russia.
There's like this little icon that's really tiny. I'm sure you can see it. And next to this report, I wish I had a screenshot. Sorry about that in advance. But when you have a metric, for example, a CPU metric or an error message, and this is a really good example. You're going through the logs, which Netdata can get the logs from your servers, and you click on the AI button next to a log entry. It'll find correlating events from other servers to give you a bigger picture of
to the Eli. There's a little maybe must have been
She was pregnant.
Microsoft.
Gates was creating a company that was selling something that previously had been given away for free. Gates had a very different vision, and he was right. Software was a business.
Gates' big break came in 1980 when IBM chose Microsoft software for their computers because it was user-friendly.
Bill Gates' software made it possible for you and me to understand how to operate our computers.
Microsoft did a deal with IBM that also allowed
Yeah, we're ready. Juan's here, our interim asset management director.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Doing this.
System online.
I don't have to leave it up to them, but I choose to at this moment. But there's never been anybody treated in the history of politics. You know, they say the two worst treated presidents by the media, etc. Was that man right there?
They feel much better.
The late, great Abraham Lincoln.
I mean, they didn't say they were going to cash him for sure, but they had the demeanor of some competent people that would cash him. So I didn't worry about it too much. And then not even a week later, 5 days later, I come home and there's another video cassette just sitting on my porch. As soon as I saw it, I just called the police like, they've done it again? You should probably look for a guy with bell bottoms on because I don't know who the fuck is sending tapes!
Linux voice control stopped.
Could look at it from a different perspective. If they are ruling tomorrow, again, that's the next day that we're expecting opinions on the IEEPA tariffs, even if they did strike the tariffs from last year away, maybe under the way and the framing that the president wants to introduce these new ones, they could still uphold those. But again, I wouldn't expect the Supreme Court to rule that quickly. And in fact, it might even be the case SCOTUS kicks it to a lower court to decide exactly how the IEEPA law is applied to tariffs going forward, Gabe.
Brian Chung, a lot to watch out for in the coming weeks and months. Brian, thanks.
Trim complete. Processed 21, quarantined 0. Renaming complete. 24 files renamed. Album art complete. Found 0 local artworks. New files sorted. 24 placed in worded folders. Quarantine 0 empty music folders. LVC-JSON generation complete with multi-word groups. Linux voice control restarted. Linux voice control stopped. Placement scan complete. Trim complete. Processed 21, quarantine 0. Renaming complete. 23 files renamed. Album art complete. Found 0 local artworks. New files sorted. 23 placed in worded folders. Quarantine 0 empty music folders. LVC JSON generation complete with multi-word groups. Linux voice control restarted.
Against him. Location. Engine 14, I'm going to go on a contact station. 52, 22, apartment 1115. 115. ESU 1130.
Airport 16 Davis, Mansour.
To have the active mode to know where you are. If you disable it, the only thing that changes is the menus and the window buttons, and I don't think that is noticeable enough. So I would personally keep it on, but you decide what you want to do. You can hide the maximize or the minimize buttons as well, though you cannot remove those Windows buttons onto the other side of the window. And you also have some focus options where, for example, the focused window follows your cursor, and you have the delay that you can tweak around that. It's basic, but it's nice.
806. I'm 23.
It is a fantastic first draft of a desktop. It is still a first draft. The applications are bare bones, the settings are very bare bones, and you can clearly see that some stuff is not animated as it should be, some stuff isn't as smooth as it should be. There are some performance problems with
spatial flight map rendered with current GPS position.
I don't know what was in her heart,
Review for our hotspot.
but I know she violated the law, and I know that officer was acting in self-defense. That raises an interesting point. Look, and if people want to say that we should have a legitimate debate about, what was she really doing, right? Was she panicking when she drove into this officer, or was she actually trying to ram him? That's reasonable conversation. What's not reasonable is for someone to classify the media that this was an innocent woman and that the ICE
Going to be focused we're talking
Channel 3 and the support and Chrono S18 has just been released. This latest edition is based on Ubuntu 24.04 LTS and so has support until June 2029, after which an upgrade should be straightforward. And in this respect, note that an upgrade tool
And joining me now from Denmark is Rufus Gifford, former U.S. ambassador to Denmark.
Linux voice control stopped. Placement scan complete. Trim complete. Processed 22, quarantine 0. Renaming complete. 23 files renamed. Album art complete. Found 0 local artworks. New files sorted. 23 placed in worded folders. Quarantine 0 empty music folders. LVC JSON generation complete with multi-word groups. Linux voice control restarted. Linux voice controls stopped. Placement scan complete. Trim complete. Processed 20, quarantine 0. Renaming complete. 23 files renamed. Album art complete. Found 0 local artworks. New files sorted. 23 placed in worded folders. Quarantine 0 empty folders. Quarantine 0 empty music folders. LVC JSON generation complete with multi-word groups. Linux voice control restarted. Reset all audio.